Some tattoos tell stories. Others guard secrets that can change everything in a single moment. When Sarah Martinez rolled up her sleeves at the corporate charity event that evening, she never imagined that the small wing tattoo on her wrist, the one her coworkers had teased her about for months, would bring a decorated Navy SEAL commander to attention and reveal a truth that would shake the very foundation of how everyone saw her. What happened next wasn't just recognition. It was a moment that proved sometimes the most extraordinary people walk among us, hiding in plain sight, until the right person sees what others missed. This is the true story of how a simple tattoo became the key that unlocked a hero's hidden past and changed everything for everyone who thought they knew Sarah Martinez. Sarah Martinez had worked at Henderson Financial for 3 years, and in all that time, nobody had really noticed her. She was the quiet woman in accounting who always arrived early, stayed late, and never caused any drama. Her desk sat in the back corner of the 4th floor, surrounded by neat stacks of invoices and reports that she processed with the same careful attention she gave to everything else in her life. The thing about being invisible was that people said things around you they wouldn't normally say. Sarah had heard every office gossip, every complaint about management, every personal story shared over coffee breaks. She listened, nodded when appropriate, and kept working. It wasn't that she was unfriendly. She just seemed to prefer the background. That's why the tattoo had become such a source of amusement for her colleagues. It was the one thing about Sarah that didn't fit her quiet, conservative image. The small wing design on her left wrist, usually hidden under long sleeves or a watch, had been spotted one hot summer day when she'd rolled up her sleeves to work on a particularly frustrating spreadsheet. Sarah has a tattoo. Jennifer from Human Resources had announced with the excitement of someone discovering buried treasure. Within hours, half the office had found reasons to walk past Sarah's desk, trying to get a better look at the delicate wing pattern etched in black ink on her pale skin. The teasing had been good-natured, mostly. Comments about still waters running deep, and jokes about Sarah's wild side. She'd smiled politely and answered their questions with the same careful responses she gave to everything else. Yes, she'd gotten it years ago. No, it didn't hurt too much. Yes, she liked birds. The answers satisfied their curiosity without revealing anything real. Marcus Webb from the marketing department had been the most persistent. A loud, confident man who prided himself on knowing everyone's business. He'd made the wing tattoo his personal mission to understand. "Come on, Sarah," he'd say whenever he passed her desk. "There's got to be a story there. Nobody gets a wing tattoo without a reason. What's yours?" Sarah would just smile and turn back to her computer. "I like the design," she'd say, which was true enough, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Marcus would shake his head and move on, but she could see in his eyes that he wasn't satisfied. He was the type of man who believed everyone had secrets and that he was clever enough to figure them out. The annual Henderson Financial Charity Gala was the kind of event Sarah normally avoided. Held at the downtown Marriott every November, it was 3 hours of forced networking, uncomfortable small talk, and speeches about corporate responsibility. But this year, participation wasn't optional. The company was making a big push for community involvement, and every employee was expected to attend. Sarah had bought a simple black dress for the occasion. Nothing flashy, just professional enough to blend in with the crowd. She planned to arrive, make an appearance, and leave as early as politely possible. The last thing she wanted was to spend her Saturday evening making awkward conversation with people who barely acknowledged her existence during normal business hours. The hotel ballroom was decorated in Henderson Financial's corporate colors, navy blue and silver, with round tables scattered throughout the space. A small stage at the front held a podium where various company executives would later give speeches about their charitable efforts. The usual crowd was there, senior management, department heads, and the handful of employees who genuinely enjoyed company social events. Sarah found a table toward the back and settled in with a glass of water, checking her watch discreetly. If she could make it through dinner and the first speech, she could probably slip out without anyone noticing. She pulled out her phone to check messages, grateful for the distraction. "Sarah, I didn't expect to see you here." Jennifer from HR materialized beside her table, wine glass in hand, and clearly already enjoying the open bar. "You look great." That dress is so different from what you usually wear." "Thank you," Sarah replied, putting her phone away. It seemed like an important event. "Oh, it is. Did you see who's here? They've got some real VIPs tonight. There's that new city councilman, and I think I saw the mayor earlier. Plus, they've invited some military people. You know how Mr. Henderson loves supporting veterans' charities." Jennifer leaned inconspiratorially. "There's this Navy SEAL guy here. A commander or something. Very impressive looking." Sarah nodded politely, not particularly interested in the guest list. She'd learned long ago that the best way to handle Jennifer's enthusiasm was to let her talk herself out. "He's over there. Actually," Jennifer continued, gesturing toward the front of the room. "The tall one in dress blues. Commander something or other. Really handsome, in that military way, you know." Despite herself, Sarah glanced in the direction Jennifer was pointing. Even from across the crowded room, the man was easy to spot. He stood with the kind of posture that came from years of military training, straight-backed, alert, comfortable with command. His dress uniform was perfectly pressed, medals arranged precisely on his chest. He was speaking with a small group of Henderson executives, listening more than talking, his eyes constantly scanning the room in the way of someone trained to assess his surroundings. "Anyway," Jennifer was saying, "I should get back to my table. The speeches start soon. Try to have some fun tonight, okay? It wouldn't kill you to socialize a little." Sarah smiled and nodded, turning her attention back to her water glass. Around her, the room buzzed with conversation and laughter. She recognized most of the faces, colleagues she saw every day, but rarely spoke to, managers who knew her name but little else about her. It was exactly the kind of social situation that made her uncomfortable, not because she was shy, exactly, but because she'd learned that standing out often led to questions she wasn't ready to answer. The evening progressed predictably. Dinner was served, chicken or fish, with sides that looked better than they tasted. Sarah picked at her food, making polite conversation with the other people at her table, mostly lower-level employees like herself who'd been assigned to the back of the room. During the meal, she found herself glancing occasionally toward the front of the room where the VIP tables were located. The Navy commander was easy to track. His presence seemed to command attention even when he wasn't speaking. She noticed how people leaned in when he talked, how they straightened their shoulders when he looked their way. There was something about military bearing that civilian authority couldn't quite replicate. When the speeches began, Sarah settled back in her chair, resigned to enduring the next hour of corporate cheerleading. Mr. Henderson took the podium first, talking about the company's commitment to community service and their proud tradition of supporting veterans' causes. The words washed over her like background noise. The same generic phrases about responsibility and giving back that she'd heard at every corporate function she'd ever attended. The military guests were introduced next. There was a colonel from the local army base, a retired general who now worked for a defense contractor, and, finally, Commander James Mitchell of the Navy SEALs. The room erupted in applause, louder and more genuine than it had been for the previous speakers. Commander Mitchell stood to acknowledge the applause, his movement crisp and controlled. Even from her table in the back, Sarah could see the calm confidence in his bearing. He nodded once to the crowd, raised his hand briefly in acknowledgement, and sat back down. No grandstanding, no attempt to milk the moment, just the quiet professionalism of someone comfortable with recognition, but not dependent on it. The evening was winding down when the incident occurred. Sarah had been checking her watch, calculating how much longer she needed to stay to be polite, when she realized her water glass was empty. The servers had been clearing tables for the past 20 minutes, and she was genuinely thirsty. The bar was set up along the far wall of the ballroom, near the entrance. Sarah made her way through the crowd, excusing herself politely as she navigated between tables of people engaged in animated post-dinner conversation. The bartender, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, was efficiently handling the steady stream of guests seeking one last drink before the evening ended. "Just water, please," Sarah said when she reached the front of the line. "With ice." While she waited, she unconsciously pushed up the sleeves of her dress jacket. The ballroom had grown warm as the evening progressed, and the simple gesture was automatic, a way to cool down without removing her jacket entirely. She was reaching for her water glass when a voice behind her said, "Excuse me, miss." Sarah turned to find Commander Mitchell standing directly behind her, his expression serious and focused. Up close, he was even more imposing than he'd appeared from across the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in harsh conditions. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were fixed on her left wrist with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "But I couldn't help noticing your tattoo. May I ask where you got it?" Sarah looked down at her wrist, where the small wing design was clearly visible. The question wasn't unusual. People asked about tattoos all the time. But something in the commander's tone suggested this wasn't casual curiosity. "It was done a few years ago," she said carefully. "A shop in San Diego." Commander Mitchell's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. "San Diego," he repeated. "Would you mind if I asked which shop?" The conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby guests. Sarah could see Jennifer from HR craning her neck to see what was happening, along with several other colleagues who'd noticed the Navy SEAL talking to their quiet accountant from the back office. "Eternal Ink," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "On Fifth Avenue." The commander nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. "I know the place," he said. "They do good work, especially for people in the service." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Sarah wasn't ready to acknowledge in a room full of her coworkers. She could feel the weight of curious stares, the whispered conversations beginning to ripple outward from their position at the bar. "I should get back to my table," she said, reaching for a water glass. But Commander Mitchell wasn't finished. He stepped slightly closer, his voice dropping so that only she could hear. "That's not just any wing design," he said quietly. "That's a Screaming Eagle. Specifically, it's the mark that Naval Special Warfare Group 2 uses for their combat veterans. I've only seen that exact design on 3 other people, and they all earned it the hard way." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her water glass. Around them, the noise of the party continued, but she felt as though she and the commander were standing in a bubble of sudden, dangerous silence. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew he wasn't buying it. Commander Mitchell studied her face for another long moment. Then, without warning, he stepped back and came to attention, spine straight, shoulders square, chin level. His right hand snapped up in a crisp military salute, held perfectly, unmistakably directed at her. The gesture was like a thunderclap in the crowded room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people turned to see what was happening. Sarah could hear the sharp intake of breath from the guests nearest to them, could see the confusion and shock spreading across familiar faces as they tried to process what they were witnessing. Commander James Mitchell, decorated Navy SEAL, war hero, the guest of honor at their corporate charity event, was saluting Sarah Martinez, the quiet accountant from the 4th floor who processed invoices and kept to herself. Sarah stood frozen, her water glass halfway to her lips, her carefully constructed invisible life crumbling around her as every person in that room suddenly, intensely, knew that there was far more to her story than anyone had ever imagined. The salute seemed to last forever, though in reality it was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Sarah stood motionless, her water glass still raised, her mind racing through 1,000 possible responses and finding none that would put her world back the way it had been 5 minutes ago. Finally, muscle memory took over. Her free hand moved to her side, her spine straightened, and she returned the salute with the same crisp precision that had been drilled into her years ago. The movement was automatic, instinctive, the product of training that never really left your system no matter how long you tried to bury it. The room erupted in whispers. Sarah could hear fragments of conversation rising from the stunned guests around them. Did she just, and I don't understand. And Sarah? The last voice belonged to Marcus Webb, who was standing near a table about 10 feet away, his mouth hanging open in shock. Commander Mitchell lowered his salute and nodded once, a gesture of respect between equals that somehow managed to be both subtle and unmistakable. "Thank you for your service," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the people closest to them. "Thank you for yours, sir," Sarah replied automatically, the formal response coming as naturally as breathing. The words confirmed what everyone in earshot was beginning to understand. Sarah Martinez, the woman they walked past every day without a second thought, had served in the military. Not just served, earned recognition from a Navy SEAL commander in a way that suggested her service had been anything but ordinary. Jennifer from HR was the first to find her voice. "Sarah," she said, pushing through the small crowd that had gathered around them. "You were in the military? You never said anything." Sarah set down her water glass with deliberate care, buying herself a moment to think. The careful anonymity she'd built over 3 years at Henderson Financial was gone, shattered by a simple gesture of recognition from someone who understood the significance of what she carried on her wrist. "I was," she said simply, knowing that every word she spoke now would be analyzed and repeated throughout the office on Monday morning. "What branch?" The question came from Tom Bradley, one of the senior accountants who'd barely spoken to her in all the time they'd worked together. Sarah glanced at Commander Mitchell, who was watching her with an expression that was both protective and curious. He gave her the slightest nod, as if to say the choice of what to reveal was hers. "Navy," she said. "What did you do?" Marcus Webb had pushed his way to the front of the growing crowd, his eyes bright with the excitement of someone who'd finally found the secret he'd been looking for. "What was your job?" The questions were coming faster now, as her co-worker's shock gave way to curiosity. Sarah could see Mr. Henderson himself working his way through the crowd, drawn by the commotion at the bar. In a few minutes, she'd be facing her boss and half the company's senior management, all wanting to know why their quiet accountant had just exchanged military courtesies with a decorated Navy SEAL. "I think," Commander Mitchell said, his voice cutting through the chatter with the authority of command, "that this might not be the best place for this conversation." He was right, of course, but Sarah could see in the faces around her that there was no going back to the way things had been. The questions would follow her now, whether she answered them tonight or not. "It's okay," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I was in Naval Special Warfare." The effect of these words was immediate and electric. The crowd that had been pressing closer suddenly took a collective step back, as if they had just learned they were standing next to something dangerous. Naval Special Warfare wasn't a job that people, especially women, stumbled into by accident. "You were a Navy SEAL?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the question. "Women can't be SEALs," Tom Bradley said flatly. "They don't allow it." Commander Mitchell's expression darkened slightly at the dismissive tone. "Women can serve in special warfare support roles," he said carefully. "Some of those roles require the same training, the same standards, and carry the same risks as SEAL operations." Sarah appreciated the careful phrasing, the way he was protecting her story while still acknowledging the truth of her service. But she was tired suddenly, tired of hiding, tired of pretending, tired of being underestimated by people who had no idea what she'd given up to blend into their ordinary world. "I was a special warfare combatant craft crewman," she said clearly. "SWCC. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. I was attached to SEAL Team 2 for most of my final deployment." The silence that followed was different from the excited chatter that had erupted after the salute. This was the heavy quiet of people realizing they'd been fundamentally wrong about someone they thought they knew. SWCC operators weren't widely known outside military circles, but anyone who knew anything about special operations understood that they were the elite boat crews who inserted and extracted SEAL teams in hostile territory. They trained alongside SEALs, faced the same enemy fire, and carried the same burden of operating in the most dangerous places on Earth. Mr. Henderson had finally reached the group, his face flushed from pushing through the crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded, then stopped short when he saw Commander Mitchell. "Commander, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, sir," the commander replied. "I was just recognizing one of your employees for her military service." Mr. Henderson's eyes moved from the commander to Sarah, his expression confused. "Sarah, you were in the military? Why didn't you mention this on your application? We specifically ask about veteran status for our hiring preferences." The question hung in the air, loaded with implications about honesty and disclosure that Sarah wasn't ready to address in front of a crowd of curious onlookers. She could see the calculation in her boss's eyes, the way he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about her work performance, her background, her potential. I prefer not to talk about my service, she said simply. But this is wonderful. Mr. Henderson's confusion was giving way to excitement as he began to see the PR possibilities. We're always looking for ways to demonstrate our support for veterans. You should have told us. We could have featured your story in our newsletter, maybe done something for Veterans Day. Sarah's stomach clenched at the thought of being featured, displayed, turned into a symbol for corporate marketing. It was exactly the kind of attention she'd been trying to avoid. I don't think that would be appropriate, she said firmly. Why not? Marcus was still hovering at the edge of the conversation, his journalist instincts in full gear. If you served your country, you should be proud of it. People would be inspired by your story. My story isn't for inspiration, Sarah said, her voice carrying an edge that made several people step back. It's just what happened. Commander Mitchell was watching her carefully, and she could see in his eyes that he understood the weight of what she wasn't saying. Military service, especially the kind that earned specialized tattoos and recognition from SEAL commanders, often came with experiences that people weren't eager to share at cocktail parties. The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread through the ballroom. Sarah could see familiar faces from every department, all wearing expressions of shock and curiosity. Some looked impressed, others seemed almost betrayed, as if she'd deliberately deceived them by not advertising her background. How long did you serve? Jennifer asked, her tone gentler than Marcus's aggressive questioning. 8 years, Sarah replied. And you never told anyone? Not anyone at work. Tom Bradley's question carried a note of accusation. It wasn't relevant, Sarah said. Not relevant. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're a war hero hiding in accounting, and it's not relevant. I'm not a hero, Sarah said quickly, the automatic response of someone who'd had this conversation before. I did my job. Commander Mitchell stepped forward slightly, a subtle movement that nonetheless commanded attention. In my experience, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, the people who do the most important jobs are often the ones who talk about them the least. The rebuke was gentle, but unmistakable. Marcus flushed and stepped back, suddenly aware that he was pressing someone who clearly didn't want to be pressed, and doing it in front of a man who had the credentials to judge whether that pressure was appropriate. The evening was clearly over for Sarah, even though the official event would continue for another hour. She could feel the weight of all those eyes on her, the whispered conversations that would follow her departure, the speculation that would dominate Monday morning coffee breaks. I should go, she said, looking around for the quickest path to the exit. Wait, Mr. Henderson said. Sarah, we should talk about this. Maybe we could set up a meeting next week. I think there are some opportunities we should discuss. The word opportunities made Sarah's skin crawl. She could imagine exactly what kind of opportunities her boss was envisioning. Photo ops for the company website, speaking engagements at veteran events, her face, and story used to burnish Henderson Financial's reputation as a veteran-friendly employer. I don't think that's necessary, she said. But surely you understand the value. I understand perfectly, Sarah cut him off, her voice carrying enough authority to stop him mid-sentence. And I'm not interested. Commander Mitchell cleared his throat softly. Mr. Henderson, he said, perhaps this conversation would be better held at another time, in a more private setting. It was a diplomatic suggestion that was clearly in order. Mr. Henderson, recognizing the superior authority of a decorated military officer, nodded reluctantly. Of course. We can discuss this later. Sarah, why don't you take tomorrow off? Give yourself some time to process this evening. Sarah almost smiled at the suggestion that she needed time to process having her cover blown. What she needed was to figure out how to live with the consequences of being seen, really seen for the first time in 3 years. She began moving toward the exit, but Commander Mitchell fell in a step beside her. Ms. Martinez, he said quietly, if you don't mind me asking, how long has it been since you got out? For years, she said without stopping. And you've been here the whole time? The whole time. They walked in silence for a few steps before he spoke again. That's a hard transition to make alone. Sarah stopped and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since their conversation began. She saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Not curiosity or excitement or the desire to use her story for his own purposes, but recognition. The kind of understanding that only came from someone who'd walked a similar path. You know what it's like, she said. It wasn't a question. I do, he confirmed. The hardest part isn't the adjustment to civilian life. It's the adjustment to being a civilian around people who've never been anything else. The words hit her with unexpected force. For 4 years, she'd been trying to explain to herself why she felt so isolated, so disconnected from the people around her. Commander Mitchell had just summed it up in a single sentence. "They mean well," she said, glancing back toward the ballroom where she could still hear the buzz of conversation about her revelation. "They do," he agreed. But meaning well and understanding are different things. They had reached the lobby of the hotel, and Sarah could see the exit doors just ahead. Freedom was only a few steps away. Freedom from the stairs and questions and the sudden unwanted attention that would reshape her entire working life. "Ms. Martinez," Commander Mitchell said as she reached for the door, "I hope you know that what you did over there mattered. Whatever reasons you have for keeping quiet about it, your service mattered." Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle. "Thank you, sir," she said. "But I'm not the same person who earned that tattoo." "Maybe not," he said, "but that person is still part of who you are. And sometimes, whether we like it or not, the world needs to remember that people like that exist." Outside, the November air was cold and sharp, a relief after the stuffy warmth of the ballroom. Sarah stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the night air and trying to process what had just happened. Her phone buzzed with a text message, probably Jennifer or Marcus or one of her other coworkers who'd managed to get her number. She didn't check it. Instead, she started walking toward her car, her mind already working on the problem of Monday morning. She'd have to face the questions, the attention, the inevitable request to share her story. Mr. Henderson wouldn't give up on his opportunities easily. But as she walked, she found herself thinking about Commander Mitchell's words. The world needs to remember that people like that exist. She'd spent 4 years trying to forget that she was one of those people, trying to disappear into the comfortable anonymity of civilian life. Tonight, in the space of a few minutes, that anonymity had been stripped away by someone who understood exactly what she'd been trying to hide from. The question now was what she was going to do about it. She could find another job, move to another city, start over somewhere else where no one knew about tattoos or salutes or the weight of memories that some people carried. Or she could figure out how to be both people, the quiet accountant and the warrior, in the same space at the same time. As she reached her car, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the driver's side window. For just a moment, she saw not the careful, invisible woman she'd been for the past 3 years, but the person she'd been before, confident, capable, someone who could handle whatever came next. Maybe it was time to remember what that felt like. Monday morning arrived like a storm Sarah had been watching build on the horizon all weekend. She'd spent Sunday alternating between her usual quiet routine and staring at her phone as text messages and voicemails accumulated from coworkers who suddenly wanted to connect with the mysterious veteran in their midst. She'd read none of the messages and returned none of the calls. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Sarah walked into the Henderson Financial Building with the same measured pace she'd maintained for 3 years. But everything was different now. The security guard, Mike, who usually offered her a brief nod and returned to his newspaper, actually stood up as she approached. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "Heard you caused quite a stir Saturday night." News traveled fast in their building, apparently. Sarah managed a non-committal smile and headed for the elevators, but Mike wasn't finished. "My brother was Navy," he continued. "Served on a destroyer in the Gulf. He always said the boat crews were the craziest ones. Had to be to do that job." The elevator doors opened, and Sarah stepped inside, grateful for the escape. But as the doors closed, she caught Mike's parting words, "Proud to have you in the building." The 4th floor was unusually quiet when she arrived, but Sarah could feel the change immediately. Conversations stopped as she walked past, not in the indifferent way they always had, but with the weighted silence of people who had things to say but didn't know how to say them. She could sense eyes following her progress to her desk, could practically hear the whispered conferences that would begin the moment she was out of earshot. Her desk looked exactly the same. Neat stacks of invoices, her computer monitor dark, the small plant she'd bought last year that somehow managed to thrive despite the office's fluorescent lighting. But the space felt different, exposed, as if the careful barrier she'd built around her personal life had been removed overnight. Sarah had just settled into her chair and powered on her computer when Jennifer from HR appeared with a coffee cup in one hand and an expression of barely contained excitement on her face. "Sarah, good morning. How are you feeling? I mean, after Saturday night, that was wow. Just wow." Jennifer perched on the edge of Sarah's desk, clearly prepared for a long conversation. "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah replied, opening her email and hoping the hint would be taken. It wasn't. "I've been thinking about this all weekend," Jennifer continued. "I mean, we've worked together for 3 years, and I had no idea. No idea at all. You're just so normal. Not that veterans aren't normal, obviously, but you know what I mean? You're so quiet and reserved, and then to find out you were doing all that dangerous stuff." Sarah's email inbox showed 47 new messages, most of them from coworkers with subject lines like "Saturday night" and "questions about your service" and "coffee soon." The volume was overwhelming. In a typical week, she might receive a dozen work-related emails from colleagues. "Jennifer," Sarah said gently, "I appreciate your interest, but I'd really prefer to keep my work and my past separate." "But why?" Jennifer's question was genuinely puzzled. "I mean, what you did was amazing. People should know about it, especially the other women in the office. You're like a role model." Before Sarah could respond to this unwanted designation, Marcus Webb appeared at her cubicle with a notepad in his hand and the eager expression of a reporter who'd stumbled onto a major story. "Sarah, perfect timing," he said, pulling up a chair without being invited. "I've been doing some research on SWCC operators, and I have to say I'm impressed. Really impressed. The training you went through, the missions you must have been on. This is incredible stuff." "Marcus," Sarah began. "Did you know," he continued, consulting his notepad, "that SWCC training has something like a 70% dropout rate? And that's for men. The physical requirements alone." "Marcus," Sarah said more firmly, "I don't want to discuss this. But people are curious. And honestly, they should be. You're a genuine war hero working right here in accounting. That's a story people need to hear." The word hero made Sarah's stomach clench. She'd heard it too many times from too many people who had no idea what they were talking about. Heroes were the people who didn't make a home, the ones whose names were carved into memorial walls. Heroes were the teammates who made split-second decisions that saved lives, often at the cost of their own. Sarah was just someone who'd been good at her job and lucky enough to survive it. "I'm not a hero," she said for the second time in 3 days. "And this isn't a story." "Of course it's a story." Marcus was warming to his theme now, his voice rising with enthusiasm. "Think about it. A woman in one of the most elite military units in the world, serving multiple combat tours, earning recognition from a Navy SEAL commander, and then quietly transitioning to civilian life without fanfare. That's exactly the kind of human interest piece that Marcus." The voice came from behind him, calm, but carrying unmistakable authority. Tom Bradley, the senior accountant who rarely spoke to anyone below his level in the hierarchy, was standing at the entrance to Sarah's cubicle. "I think Sarah has made it clear she doesn't want to discuss this. Maybe you should respect that." Marcus looked genuinely surprised by the interruption. Tom had never shown any protective instincts toward his co-workers before, rarely getting involved in office politics or personal matters. "I'm just saying it's a fascinating story, and she's saying she doesn't want to tell it," Tom said firmly. Maybe that should be the end of it. There was something in Tom's tone that made Marcus close his notepad and stand up. "Right. Well, if you change your mind, Sarah, you know where to find me." After Marcus left, Tom lingered for a moment. "My dad was in Vietnam," he said quietly. "Came back and never talked about it. Ever. Took me years to understand why." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "For what it's worth, I think you've got the right idea, keeping things private." It was the longest personal conversation Sarah had ever had with Tom, and when he walked away, she found herself staring after him with new understanding. People carried their own stories, their own connections to service and sacrifice. The revelation of her background was forcing everyone to reassess not just who she was, but their own relationships to the military experience. The morning continued with a steady stream of visitors. Some, like Jennifer, were simply curious, eager to connect with someone who'd lived through experiences they'd only seen in movies. Others, like Marcus, seemed to view her as a puzzle to be solved, a story to be extracted and shared. But there were unexpected responses too. Linda from payroll stopped by to quietly share that her son was currently serving in Afghanistan. David from IT mentioned that he tried to enlist after September 11th, but been rejected for medical reasons and had always wondered what it would have been like. Each conversation revealed another layer of connection, another person whose life had been touched by military service in some way. By lunchtime, Sarah felt emotionally drained. The constant attention, the need to navigate personal questions while trying to maintain professional boundaries, the weight of being newly visible in a way she'd never wanted, it was exhausting in a way that reminded her of the hypervigilance she'd felt during her deployments. She was considering eating lunch at her desk to avoid the cafeteria when her phone rang. The caller ID showed an external number she didn't recognize. Sarah Martinez. She answered automatically. Ms. Martinez, this is Commander Mitchell. We spoke Saturday evening. Sarah sat up straighter in her chair, unconsciously responding to the authority in his voice. Yes, sir. How did you get this number? I asked Mr. Henderson for your contact information. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to follow up on our conversation. Around her, the office continued its Monday rhythm, but Sarah felt suddenly isolated from it. Commander Mitchell represented her old world, the life she'd left behind, and hearing his voice in her current environment felt like watching two incompatible realities collide. What can I do for you, sir? Actually, I was hoping I could do something for you. I imagine today has been challenging. The understatement almost made her laugh. It's been interesting, she said carefully. I'm sure. Listen, I know the situation wasn't something you chose, and I take responsibility for putting you in an uncomfortable position. When I saw that tattoo, I reacted instinctively. I should have been more discreet. Sarah appreciated the apology, even though she wasn't sure it would have mattered in the long run. Secrets had a way of surfacing eventually, especially when they were as significant as hers. It's not your fault, sir. I chose to get the tattoo. I knew what it meant. Maybe, but you also chose to keep your service private, and I disrupted that choice. So I wanted to call and offer some assistance if you're interested. What kind of assistance? There's a group I'm involved with, veterans who've transitioned out of special operations and are working in civilian careers. We meet monthly, informally. Just a chance to talk to people who understand the adjustment challenges. No pressure to share war stories or relive the past. Just an opportunity to connect with people who've walked a similar path. Sarah found herself gripping the phone tighter. The isolation she'd felt since leaving the service, the sense of being fundamentally different from the people around her, the difficulty of explaining experiences that civilian life had no context for. Commander Mitchell was describing exactly the loneliness she'd been carrying for 4 years. I don't really talk about my service, she said. Neither do most of the people in the group. That's actually why it works. No one's trying to process trauma or relive missions. We just talk about regular things, jobs, families, how to explain to your neighbor why you still check the locks twice before bed. The specificity of that last example hit her unexpectedly. Sarah did check the locks twice, along with a dozen other small security habits that civilian life hadn't broken. She'd assumed these quirks were hers alone, private adaptations to a world that felt simultaneously too safe and too unpredictable. Where do you meet? Different places. Sometimes someone's house, sometimes a restaurant. This month we're meeting Thursday evening at a brewery in downtown. Quiet place, good food, easy to talk. Would you like me to send you the details? Sarah looked around the office, taking in the curious glances still coming her way, the careful distance people were maintaining as if they weren't sure how to approach her now. Thursday was only 3 days away, 3 more days of navigating questions and attention and the exhausting work of being visible. Yes, she said. I think I'd like that. Good. I'll send you the information this afternoon. And Ms. Martinez? For what it's worth, the way you handled Saturday night, the way you're handling today, it speaks well of your character. Some people let military service define them completely. Others try to erase it entirely. Finding the balance between those extremes takes wisdom. After he hung up, Sarah sat staring at her phone for several minutes. The conversation had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten, that her service, difficult as it had been, had also given her skills that civilian life could use. The ability to stay calm under pressure, to assess situations quickly, to work effectively as part of a team while maintaining individual responsibility. These weren't just military skills. They were leadership skills, problem-solving skills, life skills. Maybe the question wasn't how to hide her past, but how to integrate it with her present in a way that felt authentic to both. The rest of the afternoon passed more quietly. Word had apparently spread that Sarah wasn't interested in sharing details about her military experience, and most people respected that boundary. There were still curious glances and whispered conversations, but the aggressive questioning had diminished. As she prepared to leave for the day, Sarah's computer chimed with a new email. The sender was Commander Mitchell, and the subject line read, "Thursday, gathering details." But before she could open it, another message arrived, this one from Mr. Henderson's assistant requesting a meeting first thing Tuesday morning. Sarah stared at the email, knowing that tomorrow would bring a different kind of challenge. Her boss had clearly spent the weekend thinking about how to capitalize on having a decorated veteran on his staff, and she would need to find a way to maintain her boundaries while keeping her job. But for the first time since Saturday night, she didn't feel quite so alone in facing those challenges. There were people who understood, people who'd navigated similar transitions and survived them. Maybe it was time to stop trying to handle everything in isolation. As she gathered her things to leave, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in her computer monitor. The woman looking back at her wasn't the invisible accountant she'd been last week, but she also wasn't the same person who'd earned those wings years ago in a different life. She was something new, something in between, and maybe that was exactly who she was supposed to be. Tuesday morning brought the meeting Sarah had been dreading since she'd seen Mr. Henderson's email the night before. She arrived at the office 15 minutes early, using the extra time to mentally prepare for what she suspected would be an uncomfortable conversation about her newfound visibility. Mr. Henderson's assistant, Mrs. Chun, greeted her with a smile that was warmer than usual. "Good morning, Sarah. Mr. Henderson will see you in just a moment. Can I get you some coffee?" "No, thank you," Sarah replied, taking a seat in the waiting area outside the executive offices. The fourth floor felt different from this vantage point, bigger, more intimidating. She rarely had reason to visit the executive suite, and being here reminded her of the hierarchy that existed in corporate America, the distance between the people who made decisions and the people who carried them out. "Sarah, Mr. Henderson's voice carried from his open office door. "Please come in." His office was exactly what she'd expected. Large windows overlooking the city, expensive furniture that looked more like a hotel lobby than a workspace, walls covered with awards, and photos documenting Henderson Financial's community involvement. Mr. Henderson himself was seated behind a massive desk, but he stood as she entered and gestured toward a more casual seating area near the windows. "Please have a seat. I thought this would be more comfortable than sitting across a desk like some kind of formal interview." Sarah settled into one of the leather chairs, noting how the informal setting didn't make the conversation feel any less like a business transaction. Mr. Henderson had the polished demeanor of someone who'd spent his career managing people and situations, and she could practically see him calculating the best approach to get what he wanted from this meeting. "First," he began, "I want to apologize for putting you on the spot Saturday evening. I was just so surprised we all were, and I think my enthusiasm got ahead of my professionalism." "It's all right," Sarah said, though they both knew it wasn't. "The thing is, Sarah, what we learned about your background, it changes things. In a good way," he added quickly. "Henderson Financial has always been committed to supporting veterans, but having an actual veteran on our staff, especially someone with your distinguished service record, it opens up tremendous opportunities." There was that word again, opportunities. Sarah had spent Monday evening researching what those opportunities might look like, and she found dozens of examples of companies using veteran employees as marketing tools. Photos on websites, quotes in newsletters, speaking engagements at industry events where they could demonstrate their commitment to hiring veterans. "What kind of opportunities?" she asked, though she was fairly certain she already knew. Mr. Henderson's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Well, for starters, there's our annual report. We always include a section on our people, and your story would be perfect for highlighting our diversity and veteran hiring initiatives. And then There are industry publications. Several magazines have done features on companies that successfully integrate military veterans into civilian roles. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Mr. Henderson, I appreciate the recognition, but I'm not interested in being featured in publications or marketing materials. I understand the hesitation, he said, leaning forward in his chair. But think about the impact you could have. There are young women out there who might be inspired to consider military service, or veterans who might see Henderson Financial as a place where their experience is valued. Your story could make a real difference. The argument was persuasive and manipulative in equal measure. Mr. Henderson was skilled at packaging his business interests as altruistic goals, making it difficult to refuse without seeming selfish or unpatriotic. My story isn't inspirational, Sarah said firmly. It's just what happened, and I prefer to keep it private. But surely you understand the value of representation, of showing that women can succeed in demanding roles, that veterans can transition successfully to civilian careers. Sarah studied her boss's face, seeing the calculation behind his enthusiasm. She'd spent 8 years in an environment where people's motivations were usually clear and direct. Complete the mission, protect your teammates, follow orders. Corporate motivations were more complex, wrapped in layers of justification that made it difficult to distinguish between genuine intention and self-interest. Mr. Henderson, she said carefully, when I applied for this job 4 years ago, you didn't hire me because I was a veteran. You hired me because I was qualified to do accounting work. That's still true. My military service doesn't make me better at processing invoices or managing spreadsheets. But it does make you an asset to our company culture, he insisted. The leadership skills, the discipline, the ability to work under pressure, those are qualities that benefit any organization. Then, you should be satisfied that you're getting the benefit of those qualities in my regular work performance, Sarah replied, without needing to advertise them. The conversation was reaching an impasse, and Sarah could see Mr. Henderson beginning to realize that his usual persuasion tactics weren't working. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city as if the answer to this puzzle might be visible in the street below. Sarah, he said finally, turning back to face her, I'm going to be direct with you. Henderson Financial is a competitive business in a challenging market. Any advantage we can gain, any way we can distinguish ourselves from our competitors, has value. Having a decorated veteran on our staff is an advantage, but only if people know about it. Now, they were getting to the real conversation. Sarah appreciated the honesty, even if she didn't like the implication. And if I'm not willing to be that advantage, she asked. Mr. Henderson's expression grew more serious. Well, that would be disappointing. It would suggest that you're not fully committed to the company's success. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah had seen this kind of corporate pressure before, during her transition workshops when leaving the military. Companies that were eager to hire veterans for the PR value, but less interested in the complex reality of integrating people with military experience into civilian workplace culture. Mr. Henderson, Sarah said, standing up from her chair, I've been fully committed to this company's success for 3 years. My work performance speaks for itself. If my value as an employee depends on my willingness to be a marketing tool, then perhaps we need to reconsider whether this is the right fit. She was surprised by her own directness, by the calm authority in her voice. For 3 years, she'd been careful, accommodating, invisible. But something about the conversation had triggered the same instincts that had carried her through dangerous situations in the military. The refusal to be manipulated, the willingness to accept consequences rather than compromise on fundamental principles. Mr. Henderson looked equally surprised. He clearly hadn't expected pushback from his quiet accountant, and he was recalibrating his approach in real time. Now, let's not be hasty, he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not questioning your commitment or your value as an employee. I'm simply suggesting that there might be ways to expand your role here, to take advantage of your unique background. Such as, well, we could discuss a promotion, maybe something in business development, where your leadership experience would be more directly applicable. Or we could create a position focused on our veteran outreach programs. Better title, better salary, more responsibility. Sarah recognized the offer for what it was, a bribe disguised as an opportunity. take the promotion, become the face of Henderson Financial's veteran initiatives, and everyone would be happy. It was a deal that many people would find attractive, and she could see why Mr. Henderson expected her to accept it. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I'm satisfied with my current position." "Are you?" Mr. Henderson's tone sharpened slightly. "Because it seems to me that someone with your background might be underutilizing her skills in an entry-level accounting position." The comment stung because it carried a grain of truth. Sarah had taken the job at Henderson Financial because it was safe, predictable, anonymous. She'd deliberately chosen work that was below her capabilities because she'd wanted to disappear into civilian life without having to explain herself or prove anything to anyone. But she'd also learned to find satisfaction in that work, in the quiet competence of completing tasks well, in the routine that gave her days structure and purpose. There was dignity in doing any job well, and she didn't appreciate her boss implying otherwise. "My skills are being utilized exactly as I choose to utilize them," she said. The meeting was clearly over, though neither of them had acknowledged it directly. Mr. Henderson returned to his desk, his expression neutral, but his disappointment evident. "Well," he said, "I hope you'll give some thought to what we've discussed. Sometimes opportunities come along that we should seriously consider, even if they're outside our comfort zone." Sarah nodded politely and left his office, but as she walked back to the elevator, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with Henderson Financial. Mr. Henderson hadn't gotten what he wanted from their conversation, and, in her experience, people in positions of power rarely let such disappointments go without consequences. The rest of Tuesday passed quietly, but Sarah noticed subtle differences in how she was being treated. Her usual assignments were completed without any new ones being added to her workload. Meetings that she would normally be included in were suddenly happening without her. When she asked Mrs. Patterson in accounts payable about a missing invoice, she was told that Tom Bradley was handling that particular client now. It wasn't dramatic or obvious enough to constitute retaliation, but the message was clear. If Sarah wasn't willing to be a team player in the way Mr. Henderson defined it, then her role at the company might become less essential. By Wednesday evening, Sarah was seriously considering her options. She could look for another job, though she'd have to deal with the same visibility issues anywhere she went. Commander Mitchell's recognition had been public enough that word would likely spread through the local business community. She could accept Mr. Henderson's offer and become the corporate veteran spokesperson she had no desire to be, or she could stay and deal with the slow erosion of her position until she was essentially forced out. None of the options felt particularly appealing, which is why she found herself looking forward to Thursday evening's gathering with the veterans group. For the first time since Saturday night, she would be around people who understood the complexities of military to civilian transition without expecting her to perform or explain or justify her choices. Thursday evening came with an early autumn chill that reminded Sarah of her deployments to mountainous regions where the temperature dropped dramatically as soon as the sun went down. She drove to the brewery Commander Mitchell had recommended, a small place in a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture that somehow managed to feel both industrial and comfortable. She spotted Commander Mitchell immediately, sitting at a large round table near the back of the room with 4 other people, 3 men and 1 woman, all roughly her age or older, all carrying themselves with a subtle alertness that marked military training. As she approached the table, they looked up with expressions of welcome rather than curiosity, and she felt some of the tension she'd been carrying all week begin to ease. "Sarah," Commander Mitchell said, standing to greet her, "I'm glad you could make it. Let me introduce you to everyone." The introductions were refreshingly straightforward. First names only, brief mentions of current jobs, a teacher, a firefighter, an IT consultant, and nurse. No ranks, no detailed service histories, no pressure to perform or impress. Just people who'd served, transitioned out, and were making their way in civilian careers. "So," said the woman, the nurse, after Sarah had ordered a beer and settled in her chair, "how long since you got out?" "For years," Sarah replied. "And how's the transition going?" This from Mike, the teacher, asked with the tone of someone who genuinely wanted to know rather than someone making polite conversation. Sarah considered the question seriously. A week ago, she would have said the transition was complete, that she'd successfully integrated into civilian life. But recent events had made her realize how much of that integration had been based on hiding rather than adapting. "It's been challenging," she said finally, "especially this week." "What happened this week?" Anna asked. So Sarah told them about Saturday night, about the salute, and the questions and the sudden loss of anonymity that had defined her civilian life. She described Monday's office dynamics, Tuesday's uncomfortable meeting with her boss, and the strange sense of being caught between two identities that didn't quite fit together. The group listened without judgment or advice, occasionally nodding with recognition or making small sounds of understanding. When she finished, they sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Mike spoke up. "I had something similar happen," he said. "Not as dramatic, but I was teaching high school history, and one of my students figured out I'd been in Iraq. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about my war stories. Administration started asking if I'd be willing to speak at assemblies, maybe incorporate more military history into my curriculum." "What did you do?" Sarah asked. "I said no to most of it," Mike replied. "But I did start a small military history club for students who were genuinely interested. Kept it optional, kept it focused on historical rather than personal stuff. Found a middle ground that felt authentic. The key," added David, the IT consultant, "is figuring out what feels right for you, not what other people want from you. Everyone's going to have an opinion about how you should handle your military experience in civilian life, but you're the only one who has to live with the consequences." Anna nodded agreement. "I work in a VA hospital now, so my military background is actually relevant to my job. But even there, I had to set boundaries about what I was willing to share and what I kept private. People understand that veterans have different comfort levels with their service experiences. The hard part," Commander Mitchell said, "is that civilian employers often see military experience as either irrelevant or as a marketing opportunity. They don't always understand that there might be a middle ground where that experience informs your work without defining it." The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from workplace dynamics to family relationships to the small adjustments that marked military to civilian transition. Sarah found herself contributing more than she'd expected, sharing observations and experiences that she'd never had the opportunity to discuss with people who understood the context. When the evening wound down, Anna handed Sarah her business card. "If you ever want to grab coffee and talk through work stuff," she said, "I've been where you are. It gets easier, but it takes time to figure out how to be authentic to both sides of yourself." As Sarah drove home, she realized that the knot of tension in her chest had loosened for the first time all week. The gathering had reminded her that her struggle to integrate military and civilian identity wasn't unique or insurmountable. Other people had found ways to navigate the same challenges, and their solutions were as varied as their personalities and circumstances. Maybe there was a path forward that didn't require hiding who she'd been or performing who others wanted her to be. Maybe there was a way to be fully herself, complex and contradictory as that might be, in whatever came next. Friday morning arrived with an email that changed everything. Sarah discovered it when she arrived at work and opened her computer, finding a message from an address she didn't recognize with the subject line, "Regarding your service and current situation." The sender identified herself as Maria Gonzalez, a reporter from the local newspaper who had heard about Saturday night's events and wanted to interview Sarah about her military service and transition to civilian life. Someone, probably Marcus, though the email didn't specify, had contacted the newspaper with Sarah's story, describing her as a hidden hero working in corporate America. Sarah stared at the screen, feeling a familiar surge of the hypervigilance that had kept her alive during deployments. The situation was escalating beyond her control, moving from office curiosity to potential public exposure. She needed to act quickly and decisively to contain it. Her first call was to Commander Mitchell. She reached him at his office and explained the situation in the brief, factual style that military training had ingrained in her. "How much detail did this person provide to the reporter?" he asked. "I don't know yet. The email just says someone contacted them about my inspiring story of service and transition." "All right. First, don't respond to the reporter until we figure out your options. Second, document everything. Save the email, any other communications, any workplace retaliation that might be happening. Third, you might want to consider talking to an employment lawyer. You think this is serious enough for legal advice? Sarah, you're dealing with potential workplace discrimination and unwanted media attention regarding your military service. Both of those areas have legal protections, and you should understand your rights before this goes any further. After hanging up, Sarah sat at her desk, trying to process the rapid escalation of her situation. A week ago, her biggest workplace concern had been whether she'd remembered to update the quarterly reports correctly. Now she was facing the prospect of newspaper interviews, workplace retaliation, and legal consultations. She was still contemplating her options when Marcus Webb appeared at her cubicle, his expression a mixture of excitement and defensiveness that told her everything she needed to know about who had contacted the newspaper. "Sarah, I hope you're not upset about the reporter," he said without preamble. "I thought you should know that your story is already getting attention, and it's better to control the narrative than let other people define it for you." "You contacted a newspaper without my permission," Sarah said calmly, though she could feel anger building in her chest. "I mentioned that there was an interesting story here, that's all." The reporter made her own decision to reach out. "Look, this is a good thing. You're getting recognition for your service. Henderson Financial gets positive publicity for hiring veterans. Everyone wins. Except that I explicitly said I didn't want attention or publicity." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "That's just modesty. Nobody really wants to stay completely anonymous when they've done something extraordinary. Deep down, everyone wants their accomplishments recognized." The assumption that he knew what she really wanted, despite her clear statements to the contrary, pushed Sarah past her carefully maintained composure. She stood up from her desk, and Marcus instinctively took a step backward at the change in her demeanor. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations, "you do not get to decide what I want or what's good for me. You do not get to share my personal information with reporters. And you do not get to justify violating my privacy by claiming you know better than I do about my own feelings. I was just trying to help. You were trying to create drama because you thought my story was interesting. That's not help, it's exploitation." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah wasn't finished. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to contact that reporter and tell her that you provided information without my consent and that I'm not interested in being interviewed. You're going to make it clear that any story based on information you provided is unauthorized and unwelcome. And you're going to do it today. I can't control what a reporter does with information once it's out there. Then you should have thought about that before you shared it," Sarah cut him off. "But you can try to fix the problem you created, and you're going to try." She sat back down and turned to her computer, effectively dismissing him. Marcus stood there for another moment, apparently struggling to find a response that would restore his sense of being the helpful colleague rather than the problem creator. Finding none, he eventually walked away. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Anna, the nurse from Thursday night's gathering. "Heard through the grapevine that you're dealing with some media interest. Coffee after work? I've been through something similar." The speed with which word was traveling through veteran networks surprised Sarah, but she was grateful for the support. She texted back accepting the invitation, then turned her attention to the more immediate problem of her work situation. Mr. Henderson requested another meeting that afternoon, and this time his demeanor was noticeably different. The disappointed but polite executive from Tuesday had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely concerned about potential complications to his business. "Sarah," he said as soon as she entered his office, "I understand there's been some media contact regarding your military service. I think we need to discuss how to handle this situation." "There's nothing to handle," Sarah said. "I'm declining all media requests and asking that my privacy be respected. But the reporter has already been given information. She's going to write something whether you cooperate or not. Wouldn't it be better to work with her, make sure the story is accurate and reflects well on both you and Henderson Financial?" Sarah recognized the logic. It was the same argument that press officers used when encouraging cooperation with media outlets. Control the narrative by participating in it rather than letting others define the story. But she also understood that participation often meant losing control rather than gaining it. "Mr. Henderson, my military service is my personal business. Henderson Financial hired me to do accounting work, not to be a publicity asset. Those two things should remain separate. But they're not separate anymore, he pointed out. That separation ended Saturday night when Commander Mitchell recognized you. Now the question is how we manage the situation moving forward. We manage it by declining to participate and returning to business as usual. Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of someone reassessing a negotiation. Sarah, I'm going to be frank with you. This situation has the potential to reflect very well on our company, but only if it's handled properly. If it becomes a story about a veteran who's been mistreated or ignored by her employer, that's a public relations problem for us. The implication was clear: cooperate with a positive story or risk becoming the center of a negative one. Sarah realized that her boss saw her not as an employee with rights and preferences, but as a potential liability that needed to be managed. Are you threatening to create a negative story if I don't cooperate with a positive one? She asked directly. I'm not threatening anything, Mr. Henderson said carefully. I'm simply pointing out that media coverage can take many different directions, and it's usually better for everyone if that coverage is collaborative rather than adversarial. Then we're at an impasse, Sarah said, standing up, because I'm not interested in any coverage at all, collaborative or otherwise. She left his office knowing that her time at Henderson Financial was effectively over. Mr. Henderson wouldn't fire her directly. That would create the exact kind of negative story he was trying to avoid. But he would make her position increasingly uncomfortable until she left voluntarily, allowing him to express regret about losing such a valuable employee while avoiding any appearance of retaliation. That afternoon, Sarah met Anna at a small cafe near the hospital where she worked. The nurse was waiting at a corner table with 2 coffee cups and the kind of understanding expression that comes from personal experience with difficult situations. So, Anna said as Sarah sat down, how bad is it? Media interest, workplace pressure, and the strong suggestion that my employment status depends on my willingness to become a corporate spokesperson, Sarah summarized. Classic, Anna replied. I went through something similar when I first started at the VA. Local TV station wanted to do a feature on women veterans in healthcare. Administration thought it would be great publicity, and suddenly my value as a nurse became secondary to my value as a symbol. What did you do? I said no to the TV interview, accepted that my boss was disappointed, and focused on being excellent at my actual job. It took about 6 months for the drama to die down, but eventually people moved on to other concerns. My situation feels more complicated, Sarah said. My boss isn't just disappointed. He's actively pressuring me to participate and implying there will be consequences if I don't. Anna nodded thoughtfully. That's when you need to start protecting yourself legally. Have you documented the conversations? Not yet. Start now. Write down everything you remember from your meetings with your boss. Save all emails and keep a record of any changes to your work assignments or treatment. If they're retaliating against you for refusing to participate in publicity activities, that's potentially illegal. I've never dealt with employment law before, Sarah admitted. Neither had I, but I learned quickly. There are protections for veterans regarding workplace discrimination, and there are also general protections against retaliation for refusing to participate in activities outside your job description. Anna pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. I know a lawyer who specializes in employment issues for veterans. Want me to send you her information? Sarah accepted the contact information, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. The idea of fighting her employer through legal channels was exhausting, and she wasn't sure she had the energy for that kind of battle. Can I ask you something? Sarah said. Do you ever regret transitioning out? Do you ever think civilian life is more complicated than military life was? Anna smiled wryly. Every day. In the military, the rules were clear, the hierarchy was obvious, and everyone understood the mission. Civilian workplaces are full of hidden agendas and unwritten rules that nobody explains to you. So why did you leave? Because I was ready for something different, even if that something turned out to be messier than what I left behind. The complications of civilian life are annoying, but they're not life-threatening. That's still an improvement. They talked for another hour, and by the time Sarah returned home that evening, she had a clearer sense of her options. She could fight to stay at Henderson Financial, using legal protections if necessary to resist the pressure for publicity. She could look for another job, though she'd likely face similar visibility issues anywhere she went. Or she could find a way to take control of her own narrative, defining her story on her own terms rather than letting others define it for her. Over the weekend, Sarah made her decision. Monday morning, she called the reporter who had initially contacted her and agreed to a brief interview, but with strict conditions. She would discuss her transition from military to civilian life in general terms, but she would not provide operational details, would not discuss specific missions, and would not allow herself to be presented as either a hero or a victim. The interview took place Tuesday afternoon at the same cafe where she'd met Anna. Maria Gonzalez turned out to be a thoughtful journalist in her 40s who understood the complexities of military service and transition issues. She asked intelligent questions about the challenges veterans faced in civilian careers and the importance of allowing veterans to define their own relationship with their service experience. When the article was published the following week, it focused not on Sarah's individual story, but on the broader issue of how civilian employers could better support veteran employees. Sarah was quoted as one example of successful transition, but the piece emphasized her current work and professional accomplishments rather than her military background. Mr. Henderson was initially pleased with the positive mention of Henderson Financial's veteran hiring practices, but Sarah could tell he was disappointed that the article hadn't generated the kind of dramatic publicity he'd been hoping for. The measured, professional piece didn't transform Sarah into a company spokesperson or create the marketing opportunities he'd envisioned, which was exactly what Sarah had intended. By controlling her own narrative, cooperating on her own terms rather than refusing to engage at all, she had managed to satisfy the media interest while maintaining her privacy and professional boundaries. The story was told, the attention subsided, and life at Henderson Financial gradually returned to a new normal. Her relationship with her boss remained somewhat strained, but Sarah's excellent work performance made it difficult for him to find fault with her approach to the situation. Marcus Webb learned to keep his opinions about her service to himself, though he continued to regard her with the frustrated curiosity of someone who'd been denied access to a story he still wanted to tell. Most importantly, Sarah had learned that integration of her military and civilian identities didn't require choosing one or the other completely. She could acknowledge her service without being defined by it, could use the skills it had given her without performing them for others' entertainment, and could maintain her privacy while still being authentic about who she was. The wing tattoo on her wrist was no longer a secret, but it wasn't a billboard either. It was simply part of her story, an important part, but not the only part. And that felt, finally, like exactly the right balance between the person she had been and the person she was becoming. 3 months later, when Commander Mitchell called to invite her to speak at a private gathering for veterans transitioning to civilian careers, Sarah said yes. Not because she felt obligated to share her story, but because she had learned something valuable about navigating the complexities of identity after service, and she thought that knowledge might be useful to others facing similar challenges. She spoke for 20 minutes about finding ways to honor your military experience while building a civilian life that felt authentic and sustainable. She talked about the importance of setting boundaries, of choosing when and how to engage with curiosity about military service, and of remembering that successful transition meant different things to different people. After her presentation, a young woman approached her, a former Marine who was struggling with similar visibility issues at her civilian job. They talked for a few minutes about strategies for maintaining privacy while building